News at 5, 6, and 10.
Welcome to This Week in Kansas with your host, Tim Brown.
Hello and welcome to This Week in Kansas. Thank you for being with us this morning. Governor Sam Brownback says the current budget problems are, in part, the fault of the state legislature. The governor made the comments at the Topeka Chamber luncheon. Also, there is some controversy over emails to lobbyists concerning the budget. Some are upset certain lobbyists may have had input into the budget before lawmakers. And does fracking cause earthquakes? Well, not exactly, according to a group studying the issue. I'll tell you what they had to say. These stories and a lot more this morning. So let's start with the budget. We've got lots to talk about, guys, and the budget, of course, is in the news yet again and has been quite a bit. And a couple of things happened this last week. The comments the governor made to the Topeka Chamber luncheon, which was, I think, kind of interesting, but you know, people will jump all over that. And I remember when that happened 2 sessions ago.
Right.
And it's true. You know, the governor asked for one thing. The legislature gave him something that was quite a bit beyond actually what he asked for, and he went ahead and signed it because I don't know that anybody expected him to sign it, but he did, and here we are.
Actually, I love the story, and someone should write a book or do a movie about this event. It was really quite extraordinary. I remember very well the chess match that was played in the State House, and I had the pleasure of voting for that bill. It was a great event, something I look back at, and I'm really am fond of that experience. But it is true, the governor did propose a tax policy that was kind of in the middle, from where we ended up, what was actually being supported by I'd say the moderates and Democrats in the State House. Mm-hmm. And the governor was really left with an opportunity to say either he's going to sign tax cuts and have some type of tax changes in our state, or we're going to have nothing. That was really the choice he was left with. We tried to do a conference committee report that would have been more of a compromise between the House and the Senate versions of that tax bill, and of course the Senate was looking at an election year that year. Yep. And they were very aggressive in what they proposed. I think that their assumption was that the governor would never sign this bill. And so they passed this with that idea in mind. Of course, when they were not willing to compromise with the House, the governor had a choice of either sign the bill or end up with nothing. And of course, that was one of his campaign pledges when he ran for governor. And so he, I think, felt compelled to go ahead and sign that bill. I think he was hoping that our economy would do better than it has done. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we are in a kind of a interesting position right now with our revenues to the state.
We're in a mess, Jim.
Hey.
We're in a mess.
No,
and they're struggling with it. They say we're running out of money by mid-February. This is a mess.
Well,
it was a bad bill.
One thing we've done.
It was a terrible bill, and the governor signed it rather than negotiate with the Senate.
And can you give us some indication of how you really feel about this whole situation?
Well, it put us on a track. They came back with a couple billion in tax increases the next year to try to fix it. That didn't fix it. We're now here 2-3 years later dealing with a self-inflicted financial crisis. And they're stealing money from highways, stealing money from pensioners. And the bottom line is these folks are putting this burden on future generations, on our kids, our grandkids. We're going to be borrowing more, and we don't want to give up tax cuts. We don't want to cut any more spending, and we are going to push more debt, like the federal government has done, on future generations. That's the bottom line.
And you're right, we don't want to give up.
I can hardly wait to respond to this. This is great. I love the debate.
And Ed's right. We don't want to give up the tax cuts. I think once you cut taxes, it's pretty hard to take those back. But we also don't want to cut our services. We don't want to cut, the things that we're accustomed to in the state of Kansas. We like our roads to be good. We want our public employees to have good retirement. So we're in a difficult situation.
He said a number of things I'd like to respond to. First of all,
Sure.
the state can't have an ongoing debt that we just simply ignore. We've got to balance the budget at the end of each fiscal year. That's a fact. And so we will do that this year, as we have in every year in the past, and that's part of our constitutional requirements, and they will do that. When you cut taxes, you've got to cut spending. If you go back and look at our budgets from just 10 years ago, they were about half of our state general fund. And so we've actually essentially doubled our state spending in about 10 years. So the idea is, can we cut taxes and actually cut some spending. And I remember, I've said this before to you, Tim, we said starve the beast.
Yep.
So cutting taxes essentially forces politicians to prioritize their spending, which has not actually happened. And I think this is a good exercise for our state to go through.
Now, we've got Peter Hancock in Topeka right now from the Lawrence Journal-World, and I know Peter is chomping at the bit to jump into the fray on this one. Peter, we are in a challenging position, and the governor, the governor he made the comments about the legislature, but he did sign the thing, so it's kind of, I don't know that he can really point the finger too much.
Oh, he not only signed it, he was working behind the scenes and sometimes even in front of the scenes, twisting arms to get votes in favor of it. And for the first couple of years after that, he was claiming credit, and in fact in his last campaign, claimed credit that those tax cuts were spurring the economy. It only became somebody else's fault when the state hit a budget crisis, and everybody is now blaming that on his tax cuts. So, yes, it was larger than the package he initially requested, but he did sign it and he did work to get it passed.
Peter, we saw there was an article, Mr. Norquist was complaining about the governor's backtracking on some things and these increases in sin taxes. So we have a situation where, the governor wanted to cut taxes, and we all knew that. Now we're seeing an increase in other taxes. And I asked this on the show last week. Mm-hmm. Does this indicate that the governor's plan was a failure?
Well, I'll leave it to others to make that judgment. Mr. Norquist can say what he wants. Those are powerful words from somebody who's never been responsible for actually running something. Governors, more so even than senators or congressmen, not only have to propose legislation, but they have to make the trains run on time. They have to make the apparatus of state government work, and that requires money. I remember speaking with the governor. We have our year-end interviews in December, kind of leading up to the next session, and he's not hesitant. He's not ashamed of those tax cuts, but he did say that if the legislators want a smaller government, then the legislature needs to pass a bill that has a smaller government in it. What he did with his allotment plan and everything what he's trying to do now to balance this year's budget is basically find the money to fund all of the spending that the Kansas legislature approved last year. So he is kind of putting the pressure back on the legislature, saying if you want smaller government, then you pass it. There are a lot of legislators up there, I think, who would have preferred that he cut the size of government so that they don't have to take their public votes doing it themselves. But that's kind of where we are right now. Everybody's kind of feeling around, trying to figure out how much you can cut, if anything, and who's going to take responsibility for it.
Jim, that may be a fair comment. The governor made the cuts, the legislature supported this, gave him the budget, and then now maybe it's up to the legislature to figure out where to cut state government to make it fit.
Yeah, the cuts are obviously...
Or find the money.
Yeah, I totally agree. The cuts are politically uncomfortable for many people, because you upset folks that are used to some type of spending, and suddenly they find themselves not having that same level of spending. And then there's been a couple of issues that have been in the news regarding some of the targets for some of the solution to this, and that, of course, is my friend Ed here just mentioned, was our state pension program, our CAPERS program, yeah, which is really not stealing from CAPERS as much as it's just reducing. What the proposal is to reduce the amount of money going into solving the state's problem with the underfunded liability on our state pension program. For the years and years and years, especially in the 10 years prior to Governor Brownback's election, the state has not paid in the right amount of money to the state CAPERS program. That's really created a huge problem for us to take care of. And so here we are in the middle of a recession and a struggling economy, and this is the time we pick to try to solve the CAPERS problem. I appreciate the goal. It really is a goal. But if they've got to push off some of that for the future, we're not stealing from CAPERS, we're just simply delaying some of the extra money going into that.
But Jim, this is also an instance where the governor used this pretty heavily in his campaign too, that they had done some good for CAPERS. They'd actually turned the tide maybe a little bit, and it was something the legislature and the governor could, they could pat themselves on the back
Absolutely.
for that. And now we're right back.
Well, we're not really right back. Again, let's find out where we came from and where we're headed. The goal was in 2012 we passed House Bill 2033. that said the state would in 20 years would find ourselves solvent with our state capers program. We'd be 90% funded. That's a great goal, but some of the payments into the capers to make that happen are nearly $1 billion a year, more than they were paying before. That was a very lofty goal, and that would be great, and it would be wonderful to do that if the state's revenue would support that. And I think that was one of my questions when we passed the bill in 2012. Could we actually make these large payments to the capers program? There are a lot of people who had doubts on that. I was included in the one that had doubts. I was hopeful that the revenues would certainly come in and we'd make those payments. But in reality, what Ed's talking about is reductions in that promise, not necessarily taking money out of a capers fund that has been not very well explained in the news. And then, of course, the other thing is our transportation program. Let me remind the listeners today that transportation funding, virtually all of that money is not state general fund money. It's all funds budget is statutorily funded through different revenue streams, through fees and taxes and all kinds of things that feed into that. The state legislature has no chance to actually, if you would, address the funds that actually go into capers. And so what they've done is they make these transfers, these loans out of capers program. It's a way to solve the state's budget state's budget's issues.
Out of the highway.
Out of the highway fund.
Yeah.
And if the state had the chance to touch that money as they debate the state general fund, which they don't have that chance, they probably wouldn't have done that in the first place.
We raid the highway fund on a regular basis.
That's right.
Ed, let me
bottom line, we are protecting those tax cuts and not going to do spending cuts, and we're going to push that burden onto the next year and the next year and probably the next 20 years. We're going to make our kids and grandkids pay for what we're doing this year in terms of tax benefits and spending.
So the question we're really left with right now is, are we willing to raise taxes to not raid the highway fund, or to raise taxes to add money to capers? That's really the question we're asking. And I think that the decision is this the right time to raise taxes? And what type of damage does that do to the economy?
Well, and the choice we're making is, no, let's let our kids handle this. Let's let our grandkids handle this.
Well, we are raising taxes too. It's just in different areas, which that's a whole different. And we've talked about that on the show too. Whether this is an appropriate area to raise taxes, with the quote unquote sin taxes, or as Bob would call them on the show, the vice taxes. He doesn't like to call them sin taxes, but a lot of people say that's a regressive tax, and I tend to agree with that. I do want to get Peter's comment real quickly before we go to break on these emails that we've heard so much about in the news. Peter, this is an area where, I don't know, is this much ado about nothing, or is this a big deal to send these private emails via private email account to lobbyists back in December?
Yeah, I don't know what was up with using a private email account. There is certainly nothing unusual about governors and their budget directors and staff talking to outside people as they build their budget. It's a little bit unusual that they may have gotten advanced copies of the budget before some lawmakers do, but I think really what most people in Kansas are worried about is what's in the budget and does it pass, not as concerned about who got to see it first or who had input into it. We're all going to know what the budget does, and that's what we have to live with for the next year. So I think maybe some people got their noses bent out of joint about it. Maybe their pride was hurt a little bit. But it's certainly not unusual and absolutely not illegal for the governor to consult with lobbyists or interest groups and other people affected by the budget before he puts the final document together and submits it to the legislature.
Well, Peter, I would think the issue with this would be open records and government transparency. If it's via private email account, it's not the same thing as if it's sent from a government account or a state account. And I think that's one area where people had a bit of a problem with this. And the excuse was it was over the holiday, but I don't know if I buy that, because I know I get my email on my phone from work and private too. And I think that's an area where people were probably struggling a bit.
40,000 state employees are probably surprised they couldn't get access to their email over Christmas.
They might have been. Peter, did you want to have a quick comment on that?
Oh, I just thought, there's an interesting and I think evolving area of law about how private your private email is if you're using it for work purposes, and if you're a public employee using it for work purposes. That's a thorny issue. But apparently, reporters did get access to those emails, so it wasn't all that private. So, we'll see how it works out.
There you go. All right, let's take a commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about driver's licenses for undocumented folks here in the state of Kansas. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
You'll find the best doors for your home with our selection of Mastercraft doors from Menards. Right now, all special order Mastercraft interior and entry doors are on sale. This 6-panel door in oak or pine is just $89 each after rebate. For the ultimate stain blocking paint and primer in one, choose Dutch Boy Platinum from Menards. It has advanced extreme hide technology and seals common household stains. Save $7 a gallon. That's $35 on 5-gallon pails.
Save big money at Menards.
Attention, Kansas farmers, landowners, and distributors in the corn-producing industry. The ban on genetically altered corn by foreign countries has resulted in serious economic damage to the U.S. corn market. If you've suffered economic losses due to the drop in corn prices, legal action is already underway. Call Devon James right now. We're Kansas lawyers with deep ties to the corn farming community. We're in this with you. Call 1-800-311-6233.
You've got something to give. What do you have? A little time? A little talent? Some spare stuff? An empty truck? Come and give it at volunteerkansas.org. Volunteer. It's easy to match your time and talent to a good cause. Have some unwanted items or some help to give away? Use the exchange. It's like an online classified list. We just need you to come and give it. volunteerkansas.org.
Join me, Larry Hatteberg, and my wife Judy for Village Tours Pacific Coast Treasures. That's June 11th through the 19th. Now we'll fly to Portland and tour Sea Lion Caves in Coos Bay, Oregon, the Redwood National Park in California, and we'll see the famous Spruce Goose and the Charles Schultz Museum. And we'll end with a trip aboard the Napa Valley Wine Train in San Francisco before we fly home. For complete information and to book your passage, just call 316-721-4455 or visit villagetours.net.
And welcome back. We're talking about driver's permits for undocumented folks in the state of Kansas. I said licenses before the first of the show. It is permits. I was corrected, and I apologize for. I think I did that last show too. I keep messing that one up. It's driver's permits. It's not actually licenses, and these are permits that would be given to undocumented people in the state of Kansas, and this is a big issue both in the legislature but also locally as well. And where this was kind of brought to my attention this week was attending the mayor's State of the City address, and there was a group there protesting, saying that the city council was not supporting them as
and I think it was a fresh event in their minds, because that very same day they did have a city council meeting earlier that day, and they revisited one of the legislative platform issues on this very topic. And it had passed previously, and it was on their platform for the legislators. It passed on a vote of 4-3 in favor of putting a recommendation to the legislators to pass a provision to allow these illegal undocumented workers to have these permits. One of the council members brought this up as a reconsideration issue, and it did pass. I should say it went the other way. Yep. And it passed again 4-3. Council member Jeff Blubaugh had voted for it previously and voted against it secondly.
Now the county commission has a stance on this as well.
Well, the county commission also did the same thing, because back in December they passed a legislative agenda on the Sedgwick County Commission, which included actually it did not have a provision in there regarding this issue in any way. We went ahead and added a provision, basically in contrast to the city of Wichita. And we debated that on the Sedgwick County Commission, and it passed on, I think it was a 5-0 actually. So we had no problem adding this to our platform.
You opposed it?
No, we actually all voted in favor of not encouraging the legislature not to make a change.
Yeah. So oppose the permits. I just want
to
make
sure. Oppose the permits. Yeah,
okay.
We're not encouraging the legislature to make any changes to our permits.
Okay, Ed, your thoughts on this? Is this a good plan for the state or not?
Well, demographics show what's going on. Hispanics are the largest minority group in Kansas now, have been for a couple of years. I just saw some demographic trends that shocked me. Over 50% of the new births in 2013 in New Mexico were Hispanic. I think in Texas they were about 40%. And what the permit obviously does is another official step toward recognizing undocumented folks. And a battle is going on at the national level on this subject. the president is using executive power widely to give undocumented broader work possibilities. And I think we're going to have to watch this play out. California has moved in this direction. We'll probably see Texas and New Mexico and other states, maybe Arizona. That's where there's a booming Hispanic population. And so obviously there's a small group in Kansas that would like to see this happen, but it's not a majority.
Peter, your thoughts on this as this moves up to the State House this session? What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, I don't think it'll pass this session. The demographics are changing in the Kansas population, but that hasn't quite reached into the body of the legislature yet. There are interesting arguments on both sides. On the one hand, any kind of a state-issued permit like that conveys some sort of recognition, and driver's licenses or permits in particular can enable someone to do all kinds of other things, like open bank accounts and do other things that some people think that those who are here illegally shouldn't be able to do. But one of the other things that having a permit enables you to do is to get automobile insurance. And there are a lot of people who would say, whether they're here legally or not, they're driving on our roads and they ought to be insured. So that has become an issue. I mean, I know when I'm out on the road, if I'm in an accident, my first question is not what country do you come from, but do you have insurance? So there are some public safety aspects to it, and then there are some policy aspects to it. It's a serious issue that certainly deserves serious debate in the legislature. But my own prediction, if I were a betting person, is that it will take a few more sessions before the Kansas legislature is really ready for something like that.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, Peter. We're going to take another commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about fracking and whether or not fracking is the cause of the earthquakes we've been feeling recently. We'll have what we think we know anyway here in a couple of minutes. We don't really know.
Kitchen tune-up has just been delightful to work with. Before we knew it, it was all done, and very nice people, and they cleaned up after themselves, and it was just an easy process. Kitchen Tune-Up is just a wonderful company, and we love our kitchen.
Gin Blossoms, live Friday, February 27th at the Orpheum. A benefit to fight cancer, supporting the Dragon Master Foundation. Tickets on sale now at Select a Seat.
The water looks like a river. Let's party on this river. All day. Two best friends.
The moment using water becomes wasting water. It gets weird. Get normal by visiting wastingwaterisweird.org.
Check this guy out. He's got a bunch of statues of himself and his dog. He's got a pool filled with salt water from the Dead Sea. He's got an ascot room. But he lives in an internet slow zone, which means unless he switches to Cox, the internet in my apartment is faster than this palace. So I win. Mr. Norwick Turner Reeves Goodspeed III. I win.
Avoid slow zones. Get fast speeds everywhere with Cox high-speed internet as low as $19.99 a month. Ask how to get a $200 prepaid card.
The EMC Cakeland Reading Caravan, awarding $500 grants to elementary libraries all across Cakeland.
If you know of a librarian or teacher you believe deserves recognition, you can nominate them at cake.com.
It was just so easy to work with people from Kitchen Tune-Up. I thought it was beautiful. I thought Kitchen Tune-Up did an awesome job. And what I liked about it was on budget, and obviously it's beautiful.
And welcome back on to yet another confusing topic, and this is fracking and earthquakes. This is, when I say confusing, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek on this one, guys, but it's an interesting situation. We've seen many more earthquakes in the last year or so than we ever have in the state of Kansas, or at least from the time they started recording earthquakes. And the study from this panel that the governor convened is interesting because they said they can't really see much of a correlation between the actual fracking and earthquakes However, they do think there is some type of a correlation between the disposal of the wastewater, which is also pumped in the ground. And this one has me scratching my head. I'm not a geologist, but it kind of seems like 6 of one, half dozen the other. I don't know.
I'm not a geologist either, but I think, if I understand correctly, the wastewater is in a separate well. So they're basically pumping this in under pressure, and it's designed to diffuse into the ground. It does create pressure in the earth, and there may be other ways to dispose of wastewater, but right now that's the way it's done. And so I have heard that the idea of pulling oil out of the ground, the hydraulic fracking that's happening below the ground, is not believed right now to be the cause of the earthquakes, but certainly the study is important. I have thought though that a lot of the places where the fracking is happening is not necessarily co-located with the earthquakes. There seems to be some separation, maybe around fault lines perhaps, but I know North Dakota's had tremendous amounts of fracking, and as far as I know, they've never had any type of earthquake issues up in North Dakota. Down around the Oklahoma area, we're obviously familiar with down southern Kansas or northern Oklahoma. Lots of earthquakes down there, very small in nature. Has done virtually little, if not, I'm not sure has done any damage really whatsoever. They're just more of a nuisance, more of something people noticing. In fact, most people don't even really notice them at all. I've only maybe noticed one since this has become popular.
I think in the Oklahoma area they've had some damage. I have read some articles of people having cracked, somebody had some broken windows, some cracked foundations, things like that. I don't think we're seeing the big ones like people hear about in California or something like that. But there is, and the frequency is I think concerning. And Ed, I'm kind of curious when and again, I'm not a geologist, and I'm sure I'll get some emails from geologists, but the actual method of fracking, or the fracturing, hydraulic fracturing, I think is what they call it, they pump those chemicals and water into the ground to break up the rocks to get the oil out, if I'm not mistaken, and force some of the oil and gas out, I think.
Do you need my
yes,
admission that I'm not a geologist?
We might,
well,
actually, because
well, if they weren't connected, we could just stop pushing the salt water into the ground that's causing this. Obviously, they're connected, and I've got to speak for my good neighbors in Harper County who are the recipient of these earthquakes, and they are not huge earthquakes, but they've shaken up folks a bit. But it seemed to me a little I don't know, duplicitous is the right word to say. Well, it's not the oil we're getting; it's the pressure we're putting under to get the oil, and so. But we did have one geologist from the Kansas Geological Survey that said publicly that there is a connection. And apparently there are some studies nationwide now that are making that connection. But where this goes, it's hard to say. I mean, the oil and gas industry are so critical to the state's economy. I don't see us doing much, but they may have some liability when some of these occur, and how that would happen, I have no idea.
You know, Peter, with gas at $1.82 a gallon, I think is what I saw it at today, maybe we can stand a little bit of shaking here and there.
Well, it's below $1.80 up here in Topeka, but I think that has a lot less to do with how much oil we're producing in Kansas and more to do with regional politics in the Middle East and this, OPEC countries continuing to produce, trying to drive the price down. There are a lot of factors that go into the pricing of oil beyond just how much we produce in Kansas. I sat through a committee hearing where that report was presented, and Rex Buchanan, who's the interim director of the Kansas Geological Survey, was explaining that the fracking itself, that act of pumping and breaking up the shale or the layers of rock under there to get the oil out, that's not causing the earthquakes, because the earthquakes don't coincide in time with the time that they're doing the fracking. It has caused problems in other states where, as I understand it, the oil deposits are much closer to the surface than they are here in Kansas. Here, they're drilling down anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 feet. So you're looking at close to a mile below the surface where they're doing that. And then the injection wells are about 500 feet, give or take, below that. And what they're saying is that when fracking produces more oil and more gas, and out of that comes more of this briny salt water that has to be disposed of, vastly more amounts, and they keep putting these down into injection wells, and you reach a certain threshold point where all of that pressure down there destabilizes the earth up above it, and that's what's causing the quakes. They believe in part because those injection wells, some of them are located along a fault line that they're just now figuring out how to map and figuring out where it is. And so politically it causes a lot of problems. There are people out there who just don't like fracking, and they don't like this continued dependence on an oil and fossil fuel based economy. They think that we should be switching to cleaner energy. So they don't like to hear scientific reports that say you can safely continue extracting oil out of Kansas if you do it right, and it won't, there may be ways to prevent those earthquakes, and that's not what some people want to hear. It is exactly what other people want to hear because, as has been mentioned, the oil and gas industries are big business in south central Kansas and other parts of Kansas. I'm not sure how big it is in terms of the overall Kansas economy. It's certainly not as big here as it is in Oklahoma and Texas. But it's an important part of the regional economy in some parts of Kansas. And so they're interested in finding ways of how they can continue doing this safely without causing too many earthquakes. And by the way, those quakes are measuring usually in the range of 2.5 to 3.5 on the Richter scale, which is enough that you can feel it indoors. It's very minor. The largest one recorded so far was a 4.9. That was back in November in, I think it was Harper or Sumner County. You look up, that's enough to be felt indoors. You'll hear some things will rattle on the shelves. There might be some shaking of objects, but it's nowhere near the kinds of big earthquakes we hear about in California and other parts of the world. The Richter scale is a funny thing; it's hard to explain. But you have to get higher up in numbers before they start being a real threat.
Yeah, it's one of those things, guys, where I think with the oil and gas industry and the money that there is in the state of Kansas, I think I would have a strange feeling that this isn't going to change anytime soon. Maybe they will look for safer ways to dispose of the wastewater, or different ways to dispose of the wastewater, and try to keep it away from the fault lines. But I think we're going to continue fracking. I'm just going to guess.
There was an earthquake that happened, I guess, a long time ago, back in the 1800s or something like that, that basically reversed the flow of the Missouri River.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up, and I do know that there are some pretty significant fault lines here in the state of Kansas, and of course in Oklahoma. They're down in southwest Oklahoma, and there's kind of a little mountainous region down there. There were always had earthquakes down there. It was pretty common, and of course they have quite a few more now. But it's interesting. We do, we're not in California, but
we don't know that correlation is not causation necessarily. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would say that if there's going to be a big earthquake, I'd rather have a whole bunch of little bitty ones to leave that pressure over time and not have the big one, so to speak.
So fracking's doing us a favor then. That's what you're saying.
Perhaps.
Let's take it to the commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about marijuana on the ballot in the city of Wichita, and possibly in the state. We'll be back.
Modern Family, TV's picture-perfect comedy. From mugshots to beauty shots.
Hold that, good, now smolder. Perfect.
Nobody captures comedy like Modern Family.
Better arms down. There you go. Can I get a copy? Oh, there'll be a lot of copies. Oh, great.
TV's picture-perfect comedy, Modern Family, nightly.
Weeknights at 6:30, only on Cakeland.
About to buy flooring from a carpet store? Stop! You've got to shop The Floor Project, the first truly unique flooring store in Wichita, featuring wide, bright aisles displaying only the latest, most popular flooring styles. Select any floor, then virtually try it before you buy it, using our Easy View Room Designer to see how it looks in any room setting, even your own room. You'll love what you see. Then take home huge flooring samples at no charge. During The Floor Project's holiday flooring sale, save up to 17% on every in-stock floor. The Floor Project. Selection, service, price.
The Fresh Off the Boat double-decker premiere is so big, you get 2 new episodes, so you can really get a taste.
Free sample. This is free. Okay.
Fresh Off the Boat, 2-episode premiere Wednesday on ABC.
The shooting has started. In the long run, however, all that will matter is who fired the last shot.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you.
World War II remembered. Leaders, battles, and heroes. Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, Abilene.
Join me, Larry Hatterberg, and my wife Judy for Village Tours Pacific Coast Treasures. That's June 11th through the 19th. Now we'll fly to Portland and tour Sea Lion Caves in Coos Bay, Oregon, the Redwood National Park in California, and we'll see the famous Spruce Goose and the Charles Schulz Museum. And we'll end with a trip aboard the Napa Valley Wine Train in San Francisco before we fly home. For complete information and to book your passage, just call 316-721-4455 or visit villagetours.net.
When a storm is on the horizon, when the clock is ticking, you need time. Cake First Alert is there, keeping you ahead of the storm, giving you the time you need. Jay Prater on the Cake First Alert team. Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting.
And welcome back. It looks like marijuana will actually be on the ballot here in the city of Wichita coming up, and actually it may happen statewide as well. We've heard some rumblings about a bill at the legislature to lessen the penalties for marijuana possession, and of course the proponents of this, I think one of the big things they say is that it will help overcrowding in jails and prisons and things like that.
Yeah, I don't think there's actually overcrowding in our jails as a result of our marijuana laws right now. I talked to our sheriff about this issue just today and asked how many people are in our jail as a result of marijuana possession, and his answer was, well, 4 months ago they did a snapshot to get that answer, and the answer was one person, and that person was in there not because of marijuana, but because they were a flight risk or something like that. It had nothing to do with marijuana itself. And even on the second offense, when it becomes a felony, they're let on their own recognizance, usually a bond of 0. So there's not a lot of people in jail as a result of this. There is a problem with potentially getting jobs because of the criminal record that this creates.
You know, Ed, we talked about this on a couple of shows ago, and I think the overwhelming comment from people was there was no way this would happen. But it is on the ballot, or it will be here in the city of Wichita. And then the next question I think that people will have will be, even if Wichita passes this, state law, I believe, would supersede a city ordinance
I
like
think
this.
so, and I can't remember, one city official said the city would not spend money to defend the ordinance in court. So, but what it reflects is changing preferences, changing opinions about marijuana. I can't cite the number of states that now authorize medical marijuana in some form. Obviously, our bordering state has commercial marijuana. And our own Charles Koch is funding significant efforts to decriminalize a variety of offenses. And so I think it's kind of part of a trend. I understand the legislature's also bringing this up and may lighten these the sentencing on it. So we're, as usual, a part of changing politics, changing preferences, and I think sooner or later we'll change too.
Peter, this doesn't stand a chance, I would think, of passing this session, but it is, again, one of those things, as Ed just mentioned, maybe it's a sign of the times, I don't know.
Yeah, there is serious discussion going on about the medical marijuana bill. I think that's getting very serious hearings. It has a surprising group of people behind that. Lowering the penalties, there's a bill in there to reduce the level of charge for your first 2 marijuana convictions. The first one would be like a Class B misdemeanor, and the second one would be a Class A misdemeanor. Only on your third possession would it become a felony. But you talk about the changing times. There was an interesting graphic on a website called Vox.com recently. That's where Nate Silver, the 538 guy, went to Vox when he left the New York Times, showing the states where it is now legal to get high at a same-sex wedding. And it's a pretty significant number of states that include a a large percentage of the U.S. population. There were only 3 states, I heard in another report, 3 states, and they're all pretty small, where it's legal to get high at a same-sex wedding while carrying a concealed handgun. I think Alaska, Vermont, and New Mexico. I guess that's what they call the full Monty of libertarianism in the United States. But there are changing attitudes about that, and it's probably just a matter of time. At the federal level, of course, the Obama administration has certainly put no effort to enforce federal marijuana laws in those states that have legalized it. So I think gradually, over the next few years, you're probably going to see, if not having it fully legalized, taxed, and regulated, the penalties and the enforcement of it is really tapering off.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's take another commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Kochs and their efforts in coming elections and really ramping things up there. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
Home Sweet Home Show. Everything you can imagine for the home in one place. See the latest innovations, compare prices, talk to experts. It's going to be sweet. February 5th through 8th at Century 2. Free parking at Lawrence Dumont. Find out more at wabahome.com.
Relax in style with Max from Menards. The Saks freestanding tub has a high backrest for extra comfort. $599. The Olympia round shower includes an acrylic base and a door featuring silent rollers. $699. Add a fresh look with Mohawk ceramic tile. 12 by 12 Lakeview tile comes in 3 styles for $119 each. 7 by 20 wood lane tile has the look of rustic wood flooring. In 2 finishes, just $149 each.
Save big money at Menards.
At Habitat for Humanity, why isn't a question, it's the answer. It's why we build. So that a child can live in a healthy home where they can learn and grow to their full potential. It's why we build. For families searching for stability and for those wanting to help themselves and their neighbors, it's why we build. To break down barriers and establish vibrant communities filled with hope, it's why we build. To offer families a hand up, not a handout, and to partner with them to provide a safe, decent, and affordable place to live, it's why we build. To open doors of new opportunity and the promise of a new start for a better life. It's why we build. You see, Habitat for Humanity builds so much more than houses. We build homes, communities, and hope. What will you build? Visit Habitat.org.
Home Sweet Home Show. Everything you can imagine for the home in one place. See the latest innovations, compare prices, talk to experts. It's going to be sweet. February 5th through 8th at Century 2. Free parking at Lawrence Dumont. Find out more at wabahome.com.
And welcome back. We've talked in recent weeks about the Koch influence both on politics at a state level and a national level. And there's not really, I think, any doubting the fact that there is a pretty significant amount of influence. But at a national level in particular, it seems like things are growing. And you know, there was a time, I think, when the Kochs were much more secretive about this type of effort. I don't think they really are now. I think, you know, they are wearing this pretty proudly. And an event that happened in Palm Springs just recently, which was a gathering of large donors. There were some efforts to raise, I think they were saying close to $900 million for the coming elections, which is a huge amount of money.
If I understand correctly, it's basically about double what they've planned in the past. This is not their own money, though. This is not. It was advertised. It was them spending $900 million. That's not accurate. It's really them raising a goal of $900 million to affect the elections. And we all know that the elections have gotten more expensive. The Supreme Court ruled years ago about corporations donating money towards political campaigns and such, and it's a First Amendment issue. I looked back, and it looks like President candidate Mitt Romney raised nearly $1 billion, and Barack Obama raised more than $1 billion. So the two candidates alone spent about $2 billion between the two of them. Yeah. And so the elections are certainly expensive. RNC raising about $700 million as a national effort. So Kochs are certainly in the game to make the difference.
And that has the parties worried, I believe, both Democrats and Republicans.
They are in the game, and that's their right, I mean, to exercise influence. But Tim, you said not secretive. My invitation to this may have gotten lost in the mail, and I don't know about yours. This was not a open public discussion. There were, very carefully handpicked folks invited. Very few elected folks, actually, which is natural.
But there were some elected folks there to kind of to campaign, to stump a little bit.
Well, but not many. Yeah. And I'm just challenging the that they're not secretive. We will not be able to trace $1 of spending by the Kochs in the upcoming election, because it's done through nonprofit groups that essentially protect their donors from disclosures. Yeah. And we simply won't know. And I did research on this a couple of years ago, and of all the folks who have written about the Kochs and their involvement in politics, no one can say with any certainty how much money they actually put into
Isn't the same thing true for George Soros and Warren Buffett?
And that's true. It's not one side or the other. Right. There will be counterbalancing folks on the other side. So it's their God-given right. It's the legal vehicles they're using, but I'm trying to counterbalance Tim that they're somehow coming into the open and sharing with us their strategies and what they plan to spend. No, that's not going to happen.
$890 million, I know that.
Well, that's a guess.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of money. Peter, jump in here and give us your thoughts on this whole situation.
Well, my first thought about the Citizens United decision is that for many people, it wasn't as shocking as a lot of people are led to believe. The idea that corporations have a right to free speech, it kind of falls in line with a lot of First Amendment decisions that the court had been making up to that point. I work for a newspaper, and that newspaper is owned by a corporation. So if the Koch Industries Incorporated doesn't have a right to free speech, then I get worried that the World Company Incorporated, which owns the Lawrence Journal-World, may not have a right to free speech. The interesting part to me is that as we're seeing this explosion of third-party independent money, and we have already passed the threshold in Kansas, the amount of third-party money spent in the last election here a few months ago far exceeded what was spent by the actual campaigns. But as this spending is increasing, people are starting to question how effective it is, particularly in an age when more and more younger people are cutting the cord, as they say. They no longer have landlines, so they can't be, they can't be called and campaigned to over the phone. They're cutting cable and satellite and going to video on demand over the internet. So it's getting to be a very difficult population to reach with traditional advertising. So the question is, you can spend all that money you want, you can fill up the airwaves, but who are you talking to anymore? We're going through a lot of social and political changes in that arena, and I just think it's fascinating to sit back and watch.
I agree with you there. It is interesting, And you know, I appreciate your thoughts on that, because it is interesting, and it's with this last election cycle we saw, and Peter mentioned it, all this a tremendous amount of outside money that came into the state of Kansas on both sides, though, and I think it certainly had an impact on the election. And Peter mentions the younger folks that maybe it doesn't reach quite so well, but I think we still see younger people not voting as much as older people, and so I do think it has a pretty significant impact. Now, is it fair or not? I don't know. There are pretty good arguments on both sides on that, but it is very interesting.
Well, folks pretty much had their belly full of commercials by election day, and it's hard to assess the influence of that. And it does come in on both sides. I mean, it's certainly in the Senate race and the governor's race, there were groups that fairly
I'm still kind of wondering, why is this even a story? I mean, you know, it just, I support the right to give to the people we believe have the right ideology, and the Kochs have that same right. I just don't understand exactly why this is such a big story, really.
I think people are fascinated by it, though, and I think people are fascinated with the Kochs for whatever reason, and maybe in our modern society we look at them and with the kind of wealth they have, and I think it's a very interesting thing to watch and to see what kind of an impact it actually will have. And you know, I said this earlier, and I truly believe this. I think both parties are worried by things like this, because it is a control issue that they are losing. And when you talk about this Koch group, and not the Kochs, but the group that they're assembling, they're going to spend more money than the Republican National Convention will spend on the next election. They're not going to just
But there are a couple groups here in Kansas that have more to say about what the Republican lawmakers are doing than the party does.
Yeah.
And I think that's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a commercial break. We're running low on time. We need to still talk about municipal elections when we come back. We'll hit that.
Gin Blossoms, live Friday, February 27th at the Orpheum. A benefit to fight cancer, supporting the Dragon Master Foundation. Tickets on sale now at Select-A-Seat.
When you want a dependable truck, you want the most awarded pickup of 2014. You want the truck from the family of the most dependable, longest-lasting full-size pickups on the road. You want the Chevy Silverado, made of high-strength dependability. Now current GM owners can trade up to get $7,500 total value on select 1,500 Silverados in stock the longest. Chevrolet, find new roads.
Wouldn't it be nice if someone made mom's life easier? Someone on call when the kids got sick. Someone with the perfect dinner idea. A team of fellow dog walkers, potty trainers, and tantrum tamers. Someone who listens, who understands, who lends a hand. Wouldn't it be nice if moms didn't have to do it all on their own? At Moms Every Day, we're making mom's life easier.
The Fresh Off the Boat double-decker premiere is so big, you get 2 new episodes, so you can really get a taste.
Free sample. This is free. Okay.
Fresh Off the Boat, 2-episode premiere Wednesday on ABC.
It's not too late to be safe and get your furnace checked. And don't forget to replace your batteries and your carbon monoxide and smoke alarms.
Take First Alert. Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting.
Gin Blossoms, live Friday, February 27th at the Orpheum. A benefit to fight cancer, supporting the Dragon Master Foundation. Tickets on sale now at Select-A-Seat.
And welcome back. We mentioned a little bit earlier in the show the mayor of Wichita, Carl Brewer, his State of the City address that happened a little bit earlier this week. And one of the things that he talked about in his State of the City address was municipal elections. And this was an area that he was obviously quite passionate about, and he does not want to see municipal elections moved from the fall. And you have a different thought on that.
Of course, he was very passionate. In fact, it was interesting. I looked at his published written remarks of his speech, and the comments he made at the State of the City address, those comments about the elections were not in the written speech. So it was something from the cuff, something that he felt very passionate about, and he was very loud about it. But of course, he is a nonpartisan elected incumbent. And many of those folks in that camp are resisting the idea of having this change. What happened right before that was that the county commission made a recommendation to the state legislature, and we encouraging them to make this change, moving city spring
Why make
elections
the
to
change,
fall.
though?
It really is about voter turnout. We don't care if it's partisan or nonpartisan so much, but we do think voter turnout's a big deal. I live in Derby. We actually had some of the wards the last election, about 7,500 constituents per ward. One person elected with 86 total votes in that entire ward. They, controlling about roughly $50 million. And so the voter turnout is just so low. Sometimes it's less than 2%, sometimes it's 6%, but it's low everywhere. Even in really heavy contested races, it's still very, very low.
Ed, the argument against this is that the municipal elections are a nonpartisan effort, although I think a lot of people do realize that this person is a Democrat or this person is a Republican. But it is a little different animal.
Most of the issues at the local level are not partisan issues. I'd say that is true, particularly at the city level. But I think in my work with county commissioners and city officials, elected folks, rarely is a local issue turn on party. And so we've had this long tradition of nonpartisan and city and school elections separated. And I mean, you could certainly argue because of turnout that maybe they should be changed. Folks, elections that have been moved, the research on this wouldn't show that there's any dramatic change in that. But so I don't know there's a compelling case one way or the other.
I'll give you one more instance, however. We have a federal law that says you have to mail ballots to our overseas military 45 days before the election. The problem with that is the deadlines for filing is less than 45 days from the election. So we don't even know who's on the ballot. We can't possibly comply with that federal law. Same thing's true for the general election. We don't know who's going to advance in the primary. You only have 4 weeks between the two. You can't possibly comply with federal law. It is certainly a big deal, and plus the weather and the sunlight are also factors for these elections. So the fall is just better.
Financially makes a little more sense. We've got about
if it's partisan, you could save an election. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, interesting. Well, again, this will be something that we'll, of course, cover and watch as it moves through the legislature. Guys, we're out of time. Thank you very much for being on the program. We appreciate you watching the show. If you have any questions or comments, please email me at thisweekinkansas@cake.com. Hope you have a wonderful week.
When we first worked with Kitchen Tune-Up, it was at another residence. They met